means that psychology and psychiatry and social work is a self-selected faction with liberal views, and the field lacks the balance of ideological heterogeneity. Lacks a balance of. There we go. Yeah, this is okay. This actually comes to a good point then, because my fears with peer review and my concern has always been with any scientific discipline, and particularly with social sciences at this point, if you do not have diversity of thought, you get into this kind of groupthink spiral, and you're not able to actually get at the truth because you are no longer identifying any biases and preferences you have for certain things to be able to go back and forth. Organized skepticism works very well when you have actual divergent viewpoints. Okay. This is not what I was planning to record on. I actually had something else queued up for tonight, but then I saw this cross my radar, and my initial take when I saw the headline and skimmed it a little bit was like, what the fuck, man? Really? What the fuck? Okay. Peer review has its problems. You followed this channel long enough, you know that. I know that many folks know that peer review has its problems. But this is utterly insane, because censoring a peer review does not help for good science, straight up. And the reason, as I understand it, that a peer review has been censored by the editor of the journal, mind you, has to do with being insensitive. Is the purpose of science to be sensitive? No. The purpose of science is to get at the truth, and oftentimes this means you are going to be insensitive. Now, this is not to say that reviewers should be nasty, should be unprofessional, should get vindictive, or all that. No, of course not. That's disgusting. Don't do that. I have had that happen. That is not pleasant of an experience. And but being insensitive, or the appearance of insensitivity, that's not the job of a peer reviewer. And vast majority of the time, peer reviews are not seen by anyone except the reviewer, the editors, and the authors. Really, all that it is. There's increasingly more public peer reviews, with some journals now publishing the reviews online for readers. Fair enough. But oftentimes this is not so. So let us get into this. And for anybody who might be watching this who happens to be a journal editor, please don't censor something because it might be insensitive. That actually doesn't help at all. If it's a valid critique that you feel is insensitive, sorry, you still should give it to the authors and let them be annoyed with it and let them hash it back and forth and all that jazz. From Unsafe Science Substack, which if you're not subscribed, you should be. I'm not logged in at the moment, but if you're not subscribed, you should be. Now they are censoring peer reviews, redactions by APA, American Psychological Association, editors for having the wrong opinion of systemic equity. Now, recommending some of this is going to reflect the opinions of the authors, FYI. This is a second guest post by Michael Shiringa. I hope I pronounced that right. The first, which you can find here, describes his experience of being censored in Psychology Today. What happened? Okay. The journal Psychological Assessment, a journal of the American Psychological Association, asked me to peer review a manuscript on the validity of a set of psychological measures for an indigenous population. Okay, so that is kind of the, not knowing the actual article, which I would not, because out of, good ethics with these kinds of things, you never share a manuscript that is under review or anything like that. You never share that. You are very good about not doing those things. That is a matter of ethics and back and forth professionalism with authors and things like that. Let's see. But that is the nature of the question being asked. Here is the the nature of the question being asked is, are certain psychological measures valid for a particular population? Okay. On May 16th, 2023, I submitted my review to the journal. On June 1st, I received an email from the handling editor notifying me that the manuscript was being rejected, but asked that I consider revising my review before it was forwarded to the authors. The editor explained that she had a concern that some of my comments were not phrased in the correct ways about Indigenous people. She was, quote, loath to give the impression that we were skeptical about the ongoing systemic inequities experienced by Indigenous people. I could either revise my review to delete any disagreement with the author's belief that the sample of Indigenous people in this study had both suffered and been negatively impacted by systemic inequities, or the editor would be happy to simply delete entirely 6 of my 27 concerns, the latter being the most efficient approach. Okay. Agreeing with the author's belief. Now, I want to preface this in that what I'm reading is from the standpoint of the reviewer, who was obviously ticked at being asked to do this, and I don't blame them. In this, if the editor thought the comment was out of line with prior established work or well-known fact patterns and knowledge and what have you, then I would not blame the editor for asking for that revision. I would also not necessarily, if I were an editor, be using that reviewer again, or having that reviewer do a review again, rather more appropriately. But this seems to be about an opinion the authors expressed that the reviewer disagreed with. And frankly, the statement there that the editor is making is an opinion. That is not an established fact. At least to the best of my knowledge. Let's put it that way. The following day, I replied I was not willing to revise my review. I explained that the authors had made many claims in the manuscript and that were their beliefs or claims unsupported by evidence. And this is the thing. If you're a scientist, it's not your job to be an activist. It is to write about claims made with evidence. And they apparently seem to make a bunch of claims that were not supported. That is the point here. I noted that my comments were written in civil, polite, and respectful language, and that these comments ought to be of some value to the authors in their attempts to get their manuscript published. Now, bear in mind, if you're rejected, you have to go through the process of resubmitting, again, with a completely different journal, which there's a lot of stuff up front that you have to do with formatting and editing authors and conflict of interest statements and all this other kind of stuff that you have to do. It's a pain in the butt to have to resubmit an article most of the time, but such is the case that is what happens when you get rejected. You have to resubmit at the same journal after revising, or you got to submit somewhere else. The handling editor replied the same day to make, quote, the more nuanced point that she was not insinuating that my comments would have no value to the authors. The problem was that my comments could appear insensitive. This is not actually about being insensitive. This is about appearing insensitive. Again, what is the job here in the scientific process? It is not care. The purpose is not sensitivity. It is getting at the truth. And the author's opinions on something are irrelevant to that. Are very irrelevant here. For an explanation of APA policy on such issues, she referred me to the editor-in-chief. On June 4th, the editor-in-chief replied that the APA's handbook compels editors to consider the tone and spirit of reviews, emphasizing that comments be respectful. I searched the internet for the APA Editor's Guidebook, a handbook, but could not locate it, so on June 6th, I asked the editor-in-chief where I might find a copy. On June 8th, she replied that she had consulted with the APA chief editorial advisor, and the handbook was not publicly available and would not be shared with me. Fancy that. Really, that's kind of strange. In the vein of open access and transparency, you should be making those things publicly accessible, I gotta say. Meanwhile, on June 6th, my review, plus that of a second reviewer, were sent to the authors with all or part of my nine of my concerns redacted. Wait a second. 6 here. Oh, all or part. So 9 total. Okay. What was redacted? The sentences that were redacted are shown below with strike-through text. The version sent to the authors of the manuscript show redacted in each spot instead of a strike-through text. The numbers are those from my original review. It was not clear why the sample needed to be referred to as indigenous. Calling them indigenous seemed again, this opinion of the reviewer here in their writing. Calling them indigenous seemed to have political or ideological overtones. Why aren't they more precisely Native Alaskan or Lakota? Okay. The authors refer to minoritized samples as opposed to minority samples. So this was completely deleted, this one. Opposed to minority samples. Minoritized is a political term that implies the samples have been oppressed. Minoritized is not a scientific term that has precise meaning, and there was no evidence that the current sample was oppressed in their lifetimes. We're getting at the individual versus the not. In other words. They're getting at the individual versus the not. He's actually applying the standards of the Institutional Review Board, which is basically whether or not the population, the people who are subjects of the research are affected by such things. Frankly, the author probably can't actually know that without making a crap ton of assumptions, but we shall see. Number 11, the author stated that indigenous peoples and families have endured traumas including genocide, forced displacement, and forfeiture of homelands. These traumas do not apply to the current sample. What was deleted here? This was not stated directly, but it appears to be implying that a psychological impact of historical traumas can be passed down through 2 generations through some sort of intergenerational transmission. This is a highly controversial theory and unproven. Further, the authors claim that these historical traumas are compounded by present-day structural racism. They provide no evidence that either this sample has endured structural racism as part of the country this sample lives in included structural racism. That sentence made no sense. They provided no evidence that either this sample has endured structural racism or the part of the country this sample lives in included structural racism. Again, structural racism is a controversial political term and has no precise scientific meaning. He's correct. It has no precise scientific meaning in the slightest. It's actually more relevant in critical theory and postmodernism, which is frankly anti-scientific. So yeah, he's right to actually point that out. You did a disservice to the authors by deleting that, editor. In this case, the editor did a disservice to the authors by deleting that because it has no precise scientific meaning. It's utterly immeasurable. And the attempts to measure it often fail because of the disparity fallacy. The disparity fallacy being that there's an assumption made that, if there's any disparity at all between groups, it must be because of some kind of systemic discrimination. But anyway, the author stated that, quote, there is a critical need to move away from an inherently, white ethnocentric lens that has been used to measure development that may overlook capturing unique strengths of indigenous families. This was a political statement that does not convey a precise or salient scientific issue and has no place in a science article. The authors did not provide a definition of white ethnocentric lens, evidence that such definition does or does not have validity, or how such a lens creates empirically flawed data. Yeah, they never seem to when they're, and I mean, the author's expressing an opinion, but I think he is quite right. That is a political statement. Unless you're going to seriously provide some backup for that, that doesn't belong in a journal at all. The author stated that indigenous populations have respect for extended family systems and elders. They also stated the family is the backbone for indigenous families. Every culture has respect for extended family systems, and elders view families as mainstay of culture. No evidence was provided how this is unique or relevant for indigenous people. All right, I'm gonna make a point actually here for the editor that I don't think this part was necessary. Here, but he's not wrong in his point. I just don't think it was necessary. It was made in the latter sentence. That's just a grammatical thing, mostly on my part. The author stated their partners preferred the term indigenous over American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native American. They did not state who the partners were or the why they have credibility for this preference. Further, it was not clear why this is relevant to the manuscript. Okay. And that one I'm actually going to give a thing here because I can probably take a guess on who was meant by partners, and in that they were probably referring directly to the people in the people who were part of the research. Let's put it that way. That would be my guess as to whom they mean by partners in this. And that comes alongside the notions of so-called actionable science, or something there and similar. The authors wrote that they honored all community input. It was not described what honored meant. This does not sound like a scientific activity. Technically speaking, it's not, but here's where I get a little thing with this. If you are doing a study with a community, then yeah, you should take their input into account. What is meant by honored? Yeah, fair question. Then again, it's not necessarily relevant to the writing of the manuscript either. The authors reported that 7.29% of children were two-spirit identity. This is a controversial sexual identity and has no place in a science report. It obscures the sexual distribution of male and female and makes the sample unreplicable. That is a fair concern, and the editor shouldn't have deleted it. They reported that some children and caregivers identified as Latinx, and then you delete the rest of it. That gives no context to the reviewers. That gives no context to the authors. But I will say, at least in terms of the polling, the phrasing Latinx is unknown to most of the folks of the community they're trying to identify, but also is highly unpopular to those who know it. I think it's like 3% of folks in the community like actually the phrase Latinx. So, oh boy. In my opinion, Latinx is... Oh, wow. Latinx was non-bit... Okay. He put his opinion in there. What's the matter? Wow, okay. I'll leave that one alone. In contrast to the handling editor's explanation, only 2 of the 9 redactions had anything to do with the topic of perceived systemic inequities. I am confident that my views are held by a minority of psychologists, at least among those who publish. But that does not mean I am wrong. It means that psychology and psychiatry and social work is a self-selected faction with liberal views, and the field lacks the balance of ideological heterogeneity. Lacks a balance of. There we go. Yeah. This actually comes to a good point then, because my fears with peer review and my concern has always been with any scientific discipline, and particularly with social sciences at this point, if you do not have diversity of thought, you get into this kind of groupthink spiral, and you're not able to actually get at the truth because you are no longer identifying any biases and preferences you have for certain things to be able to go back and forth. Organized skepticism works very well when you have actual divergent viewpoints. But what the author is saying in this piece is that there isn't that, or there seems not to be that, and henceforward, you get things that end up being haywire. You're not checking biases or anything like that. You're not actually getting at the truth. That is not healthy. Now, I will say this is not true of all peer review, that this is the case. He's pointing out to a particular problem in psychology, so don't go haywire. Don't go crazy on me on that one. But how common is redaction of peer review? I have 3 concerns. First, I have submitted more than 300 reviews over the past 28 years, and this was the first time I am aware of that my review was altered by the editors before being sent to the authors. I don't know, but to me that's highly unethical to do that. That's an ethics question, actually. It's a very ethics question. I don't know how ethical that is. I would presume it is highly unethical to do that. But now I am wondering how many times this has happened without me being told about it. That's scary. For the vast majority of reviews in the past, journals have CC'd me on emails sent to the authors, and I have been able to see what the authors see. But there have been several instances where the emails I received with the editor's decisions informed me only that the manuscripts were rejected or accepted with revisions and did not include the reviews from me or the other reviewers. Were the reviews not included because they were redacted and the journal did not want me to know? That is a scary thing. Hopefully that is not the case, but that is a scary thought. Second, regardless of past practices, it is evident that redaction of civil and respectful language of differing opinions is now accepted practice, at least by the APA. It seems to be that way, from what you've shown. I hesitate to say that based on the one anecdotal sort of opinion here, but we continue with that. Third, what is the standard for editors to decide what is insensitive language? Yeah, what the hell do you mean by insensitive? Are editors protecting the fragile egos of authors? Are they protecting the professionalism of their journal brand? Or are editors simply trying to head off the drearily predictable complaints from angry authors who had their papers rejected? If anyone possesses the top secret classified APA editor's handbook and would like to shed light on the APA policy position, I think that would be enlightening for all of us who are incapable of higher order cognitive skills, i.e., nuance, all of us who are incapable? I think you are capable, dude. I think that's a typo. Yet still value truth and science. If you're barred by an agreement to not share it with us, perhaps at least you could explain the policy on tone and spirit that I must have violated. Yeah, now he's closing with some thoughts on the authoritarian nature of that, which it is. I'm sorry, that's yeah. The events I described reflect an authoritarian regime of journal editors. Editors have the power, nearly unlimited, it seems, to decide what language is allowed and what ideas are permissible in peer reviews. It appears they can make these decisions without the consensus of reviewers and secretly, without peer reviewers ever knowing what happened. Editors seem to have leapfrogged over the democratic step of building agreement in the field for what counts as insensitivity. So, again, this is not all because we're talking about a psychology journal and one instance from a psychology journal right now. The authoritarian model is not the problem. I think it is fine and efficient for conducting business. They're his words, not mine. When the rulers are fair. The problem is when rulers favor one faction over another unfairly and there is no recourse. I think it is useful to reflect back on how this situation seems similar to the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1960s. The Warren Court, as it is known because it was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, decided many landmark cases with a liberal reinterpretation of the Constitution and impacted the culture of the country, effectively presiding over a major shift in jurisprudence that would last for generations. Some of these changes were needed, and some were widely seen as overstepping by the court to find rights in the Constitution that did not exist. Examples of school prayer and contraception drugs have been cited where activists should have tried to build consensus with the public and work with state legislators to find locally suitable compromises instead of crafting a legal case that skipped the democratic process in our Constitution and leapfrogged to a friendly Supreme Court to ram decisions down the throats of the entire country. History is still judging whether the revolution of the Warren Court was wise, or whether it went too far in some cases and acted as a fabricator of laws that were not theirs to create. I am not suggesting a total remake of peer review is needed. Peer review is not broken. No, I don't necessarily agree with the broken note either, but peer review sure as hell has problems. For example, I think massive changes proposed by the open science movement for post-publication peer review in public view would be much worse. Yeah, I agree with that. Post-publication peer review is a bad idea. Is a really, really bad idea, with one exception, and that's if you actually find fraud in the research. Not because you are offended by something. Peer review by a self-selected mob is likely to give us only the facts the mob wants. New rules, committees, or appeals processes are not needed. We already know what evidence, fairness, and transparency looks like. I'm suggesting that a revolution has occurred and we were not notified. What we need is a way to rein in deviant editors such as those at psychological assessment. Those models already exist at universities and businesses for handling problems of professional conduct. Start with a coffee chat, then move up rapidly to stiffer remedies as needed. I'm looking at you, APA. Consider this my official complaint. Okay. I hope it doesn't fall on deaf ears, but oh boy. This is certainly a heck of a situation if true. But just in terms of the broader thing, it is true that editors have a lot of power, but usually they are bound by the ethics in that you're after what the truth is, not what your political thing is. Now, of course, this has all gone up and haywire in a bit because you have more and more people who are activists who are gradually moving into the position of becoming editors or being pushed into doing activism. Try not to at all costs because the truth actually matters a lot more than a lot of the activism related stuff. And if it's something that the reviewer says is anti-scientific and what have you, I also find it highly unethical to hide reviews from a author. That's just got to be the height of absolutely unethical, because you're not being truthful with the authors then at that point. How can they actually revise and make their paper better if you are being utterly untruthful with them about what the reviewers actually said? That's just crazy. That's just absolutely crazy with me, to me. But this is not to say all peer reviews are screwed up, and I don't think peer review is broken. I think it could do with some serious tweaks and some reminders of why we do peer review is about getting at the truth. It's not about activism in this kind of thing, and making sure there's some viewpoint diversity involved in reviewers would be fabulous. But anyway, let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you all stay curious, everybody.